Nick, thank you very, very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here today and to have an opportunity to talk a bit about the book that the Institute has just published. Many professional colleagues ask me, given all of my involvement on matters related to China, what possibly possessed me to undertake a study like this. And I could give you a number of reasons, not the least of which is simply the fact that depending on the ultimate outcomes that occur in the northern half of the peninsula, and I don't know what those outcomes might be, they will have a determinative effect, I think, on Northeast Asia in the long run in ways that I don't think any of us satisfactorily or fully understand or anticipate. This book is really about the extraordinary, of seemingly improbable history of nuclear weapons development in North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. This is not a new issue, even though for the United States, it would seem that the issue begins only in the mid-1980s, when there are early intelligence indications of the building of a nuclear reactor in North Korea, and when, of course, the Soviet Union compels North Korea to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty in December of 1985. The first time a senior U.S. official even meets with a North Korean counterpart is former Undersecretary of State, the late Arnie Cantor, who meets in New York in January of 1992 with Kim Jong-sun. This is the first time that a senior U.S. official is meeting face-to-face with a North Korean counterpart and being exposed, if you will, to the world as seen from a North Korean perspective. But there's a much deeper history here that long antedates American involvement and interest, and that's really part of what I want to talk about today. Much of this history is hiding in plain sight. It's a history that is known, I would argue, to Russians, to Chinese, to East Europeans, to Japanese, to other Koreans, but to a remarkable extent not known to the United States. It is preeminently a Korean story, with the United States now only as the latest major power entrant into this drama. The book concentrates, I would say, on three core issues: who, how, and why. Who in the North Korean system feels compelled to pursue the path of nuclear weapons development? Who are the actors that make this happen? Second, and equally important, how? How does an acutely self-referential, isolated regime without the capacity for autonomous action find a way to get from a state of grievous difficulties, sustain a nuclear weapons program over the years, and now be on the edge of a multiple capable nuclear weapons program? And why, of course, is the third major issue. What is it that has impelled North Korea to act in this fashion? The nuclear issue, therefore, in a way, is kind of shorthand, it seems to me. It's really the story of the North Korean system itself, especially of Kim Il-sung, who built the state and the support of institutions and dominated it for nearly a half century. And then, of course, the history of his eldest son and successor, Kim Jong-il, who has sought to sustain the system and its identity for the 17 years since Kim Il-sung's death. Looked at one level, North Korea is really more a traditional Korean dynasty than it is a Marxist-Leninist state in the way that we conventionally understand the term. There have only been two leaders of North Korea in its entire history, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. It is the only instance of a communist state where power passed from a father to a son, and now, of course, the expectation is it will pass to a grandson. No one else, no other communist system was able to achieve this. You might call it a dubious accomplishment, but it nevertheless is an accomplishment of a kind. Kim Il-sung dominates this picture. He was a larger-than-life person, cunning, charismatic, extroverted, a commanding singular presence that dominated the Korean landscape for a full half-century. I dare say he probably could have been a very successful retail politician in other systems as well, just given his attributes. Everything about him suggested a kind of a self-confidence and an audacity, qualities that, frankly, his son is conspicuously lacking in, which explains, I think, quite a bit, which I'll talk about. What he did, of course, is that he basically captured intense Korean nationalism, a profound distrust of those outside of his immediate circle, both within Korea and, of course, in states beyond Korea. What's remarkable about it is, if you think about it, Kim Il-sung left Korea when he was 7 years old in 1919, except for 2 years when he undertook some schooling back in Korea at the instigation of his father. He spent the next quarter of a century away from Korea. 20 years in China and about 5 years in the Soviet Far East. And yet he expropriated for himself this identity as an authentic Korean nationalist and wedded his ideas to an entire system of rule, cloaking himself in this title. I said before he was audacious. If one thinks about it, Kim returned to North Korea at the age of 33. It was then not an independent state. It was still then, again, this is immediately after the Japanese surrender. And yet a year later, 1946, at the age of 34, he established a university, Kim Il-sung University, which seemed a rather audacious thing to do. About 3 years later, he managed to persuade at first a highly reluctant Joseph Stalin, and following that an equal or even more reluctant Mao Zedong to back his plans to push for Korean unification, which of course he attempted when the Korean War broke out in June of 1950. All of this suggesting a man who may have been overseeing a small country, but he thought very, very big. The Korean War is a topic I talk about to some extent in the book. It actually ends up with Kim Il-sung's humiliation in a variety of ways. Kim is stripped of operational control of Korean forces by Stalin, and operational command is given to Peng Dehuai, the Chinese commander. In many ways, the war becomes not so much a Korean war, but a U.S.-China war that happened to be fought on Korean soil. But the experiences in Korea, the humiliations that Kim experienced, instilled in him very much a never-again mentality, that he did not want to be prone or prey to any kind of domination and control by outside forces if he could avoid it. He sought, in the aftermath of the war, to construct a system and a state on his own terms, exploiting the Soviet Union and China for major assistance when the Soviet Union and China were allies, and then very cleverly and resourcefully maneuvering between China and the Soviet Union when their differences began to emerge with a vengeance in the late 1950s. Although Kim always felt, I think, a stronger affinity for China, he spoke fluent Chinese, he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Kim also knew, in effect, where his bread was buttered, and the Soviet Union provided, I think, much more of that support, including critical support for the nuclear program, which I will come to in a moment. Even as Kim sought to create this state authentically in his own image, he worked at the beginnings of building a nuclear infrastructure, encouraging scientific training, recruiting scientists, sending scientists to the Soviet Union when Moscow opened up its Atoms for Peace program, and acquiring technology and information that would ultimately provide the building blocks that would materialize in the development of nuclear weapons coming to fruition many, many years later. All the while he justified this for purposes of nuclear energy development. As early as 1955 or 56, Kim was pressuring the Russians to provide him a nuclear reactor for energy generation purposes. Siegfried Hecker of Stanford University has done an interesting estimate. He says that in the approximately 25 years of intermittent operation of the Yongbyon reactor built by North Korea, it has produced the equivalent of 23 days of electricity for a modern light water reactor. So if there really was an intent to develop for purposes of nuclear energy, which Kim said repeatedly, this has got to be one of the most conspicuous failures on record. Kim nonetheless persisted with these programs and activities, pushing the Soviet Union for assistance right up to the terminal years of the Soviet Union's existence as a state, believing that he should be trusted with these technologies. Whether in all of this he always had an idea in mind that was not so much energy related as weapons related, we can speculate about. And in my book, I do try to identify, I think, some of the critical moments in time when certain kinds of convictions and directions crystallized on Kim's mind. What's interesting, though, to me, is that the frustrations that Americans have encountered in dealing with North Korea in this period of time when the United States has had nuclear diplomacy with North Korea, that is to say for the last 20 years, resonate very, very deeply with the echoes from a far distant past in the experiences of Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and of Deng Xiaoping, all of whom in their own ways sought either to control or direct North Korea in particular ways, and all of whom failed. So there is important lessons to be learned. Brezhnev, in the aftermath of the seizure of the Pueblo, for example, said that he was alarmed by North Korean behavior. That's Brezhnev's word, not mine. Deng Xiaoping pursued without any success at all a campaign to encourage Kim Il-sung to undertake internal change in the North from the time that Deng first returned to power in 1978 and continuing through the remainder of his life. Not only that, Deng sought to carry some of North Korea's water with the United States in negotiations with the United States, only to have North Korea then undertake the Rangoon bombing. In one case, less than 3 weeks after Deng Xiaoping had provided a proposal to the United States for trilateral talks involving the United States and the two Koreas that China would serve as the host of. This led to a profound alienation in Deng Xiaoping's relations with Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il traveled to China in 1983. His father had promised Deng in 1982 that Kim would come once a year to study China's experiences and reform. Kim Jong-il did not set foot in China again for another 17 years. So there are valuable lessons to be learned in all of this. North Korea, of course, subscribes to what is called juche, which many describe as loosely self-reliance. It's really not self-reliance. It's more self-determination, the ability to control one's own fate, one's destiny, and not yield to the preferences of others, and that has been what has animated North Korea from the outset. Now, many scholars argue that the ultimate basis that led to North Korea's decision to acquire nuclear weapons was the loss of its alliance ties to the Soviet Union and China at the end of the Cold War, and that this is really what triggered nuclear weapons development. In a certain sense, there is a partial truth to that. We know that, for example, when Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze went to Pyongyang to tell the North Koreans that the Soviet Union was going to recognize the Republic of Korea, Kim Jong-nam, then the North Korean foreign minister, told Shevardnadze that under these circumstances the Treaty of Alliance was no longer valid, and that North Korea would have to pursue special kinds of weapons. So you could make that kind of a connection, but I see this more as a culmination rather than really the beginning of the process. The decision itself to pursue nuclear weapons development most likely occurred in the early 1970s. We can't date it very precisely. There's no document that we have seen that attests to this, but a variety of factors combined at that point to convince Kim that he needed to be planning ahead and that his legacy to his son would be the basis for a nuclear weapons program. And whatever his aspirations, you couldn't magically create a program. You had to have all the pieces in place. I go into some detail in my book on how North Korea sought to do this from a technical and an industrial point of view. It's really quite a story, and I commend it to your attention. But the groundwork was being laid in the early 1970s for steps that Kim would result in a full-scale pursuit of nuclear weapons in subsequent decades. Korea would become what some of its leaders called an impregnable fortress, a highly militarized state that could sustain such a strategy, but could do it only so long as there were means by which other powers would support these endeavors. Not so much the nuclear weapons program itself, but rather a broader program of political and economic support that sustained North Korea's path. Kim Il-sung's world, however, begins to unravel in the early 1970s. The moves of both China and the Soviet Union in the early détente period with the United States creates a very unsettling prospect for Kim of having your principal benefactors now associating much more closely with your primary enemy. But where things really unravel, of course, is as the Cold War comes to a close, when no longer would the Soviet Union underwrite the North Korean system, and North Korea found itself now in a situation where it had to look for other sources of aid and assistance from other countries, compelling Kim Il-sung to look at alternatives that were very, very different. And he did prove himself to be highly resourceful. One of the great gifts, or skills, I should say, that North Korea has had is they always have a way out. You are never devoid of a specific option, preferably more than one, that enables you to sustain your activities and does so in a way that you are not accountable to others. We saw, for example, even in the early 1970s, that various Western European states began to recognize North Korea. There were major credit-based acquisitions of whole plants for which North Korea never paid back a penny. At that point, Japan was a major trading partner with North Korea, as well as a source of advanced technologies. And of course, moving into the 80s and 90s, you saw an even more diversified strategy with, in the 1990s, North Korea, very implausibly, you might argue, looking to the United States to supplant the Soviet Union as the ultimate guarantor of its activities and its benefactor in the building of nuclear power plants. These alternative relations, of course, extended very much under two Korean presidents to major aid commitments from South Korea to North Korea. As we know now, when Kim Dae-jung went to Pyongyang for the first ever summit between North and South, this was done with a $500 million transfer of funds through Hyundai units. In fact, Kim Jong-il delayed the summit by a day to make sure, in essence, that the checks had cleared in Bank of Delta Asia. So all of these relationships enabled North Korea to sustain certain kinds of activities, even as its entire economy was crumbling, and culminating, of course, with the profound deindustrialization and famine of the 1990s. Now, this did not mean that there were not different times when there were, to a degree at least, some degree of, I'll call it progress or partial breakthroughs on the question of North Korea's nuclear weapons development. most prominently, of course, the signing of the agreed framework with the United States in 1994. This, of course, followed on Kim Il-sung's invitation to Jimmy Carter. The agreed framework was very much Kim's agreement. It was what he or those around him had conceptualized at a point where I think Kim, in his final years, began to appreciate the acute and grievous circumstances that North Korea was confronting. Kim dies, of course, very abruptly, only weeks after he meets with Carter. The son is obligated to the agreed framework. Whether that was out of conviction or not, however, is much more problematic. And in any event, Kim Jong-il did not have the towering status that his father had. There's even evidence, and I suggest in my book, that there may have been a degree of alienation between the two Kims toward the end of Kim Il-sung's life. The final speech that Kim Il-sung gives within days of his death even acknowledges that the acute energy needs that North Korea faced meant that they could not wait for a nuclear power plant. That would take far too long, which is really remarkable in retrospect. Kim also gave, at the end of his life, assurances to Deng Xiaoping that he, Kim Il-sung, would promise that North Korea would not pursue nuclear weapons. He did not give those same assurances about his son. So the door to denuclearization may have momentarily opened at the end of Kim's life, but it may have just as much closed when he died weeks later. Add to this, of course, there is the story of North Korea's enrichment activity, which was apart from the plutonium-based program. We understand much more of this today than we did a few years ago. It would seem as if some of these activities really are traceable even into the early 1990s between Pakistan and North Korea. This is not to denigrate what the agreed framework did at the time. I think it made sense, but it was a very incomplete and very imperfect agreement. And even in those early years, the progress of it was proceeding very, very uneasily. I do, to some extent, reflect on the book on the experiences under President Bush, the difference between, this is George W. Bush, the differences between term 1 and term 2. I do not do a detailed rendering of the debates in the United States about this. If you want the Inside the Beltway accounts, there are a lot of other books that have done a very, very credible job. Here it is much more the question of understanding North Korean perceptions and sensing both urgency and opportunity. North Korea pushed ahead when the United States decided, having determined that there was an enrichment program, that the United States would no longer be a provider of heavy fuel oil to the north. In President Bush's second term, there was a compensation package that I think was premised on specific reciprocal actions, and that did explain and account for some measurable progress in 2007 and 2008. I see this as attributable primarily to the fact that North Korea may have decided that a leveraged buyout of the plutonium program was in order, that the program and the facilities were far too decrepit and far too risky to sustain them on an open-ended basis. They were already highly degraded, and in the background you had the prospect of enriched uranium as an alternative. But in late 2008, North Korea forgoes the opportunities that did exist at the time that might have led to a step-by-step dismantlement of the plutonium-based program. And of course, these phenomena continue under President Obama, where North Korea's decision, in my view, to reassert its nuclear weapons goals and programs were made prior to Obama even taking office. So, where do we stand? North Korea today, with renewed support from China, does not believe that it is under acute pressure to relinquish its extant capabilities. The leaders of the North surely have long since concluded that their power, identity, and strategic interests are better ensured with nuclear weapons than without them. These are not a bargaining chip. More than this, North Korea postulates the essential equivalence of its nuclear weapons in its possession to those of the other nuclear weapon states, beginning with the United States, in essence, punching above its weight. Nor has North Korea been obscure or elliptical about these goals. North Korea has been hiding in plain sight. It is useful only to sketch out some of the steps that North Korea has taken to remind ourselves of what has happened. In January of 2003, North Korea, of course, announced its pullout from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's the only state that has ever withdrawn from the NPT. In February 2005, North Korea claimed for the first time to have manufactured nuclear weapons and asserted for the first time its equivalence with other nuclear states. The two nuclear tests, October 2006 and May 2009, the latter much more successful than the former, attested to its nuclear weapons goals. North Korea claims to have weaponized its entire inventory of plutonium, and of course since 2009 it has claimed advances in uranium enrichment as an alternative source of fissile material other than plutonium, and it did this after having repeatedly and strenuously denied since 2002 that it in fact had an enriched uranium program. It has also sustained pursuit of its missile program as a presumed means to deliver a nuclear weapon. And perhaps most ominously, it has transferred materials and technologies with nuclear weapons potential to other nuclear aspirants. So what do we do? And I do mean we. This is a collective failure, not something attributable to steps the United States did or did not undertake. And that North Korea over time has found itself increasingly invested in a nuclear identity. It sees these weapons, or at least the extant leadership sees these weapons as integral and indispensable for the survival and identity of the system. Now, the United States obviously is taking steps and measures that are plausible and appropriate under these circumstances related to defense and deterrence, efforts at risk minimization, counter-proliferation strategies, any efforts to impede or disrupt acquisition of technologies and the like. For those of you who have not read the panel of experts report from the UN mandated by the UN Security Council resolution, it makes for very, very sobering reading. The resourcefulness of North Korea to acquire technologies should never be underestimated. The administration nonetheless argues for strategic patience, and I would argue that they are also trying to pursue what I would call strategic prudence. In essence, perhaps trying to wait out the system, or perhaps a belief that North Korea cannot indefinitely defy the laws of political and economic gravity. What the United States seeks, I think, is a sustainable international coalition that sharpens the policy choices confronting North Korea, seeks to deny North Korea any legitimation for the weapons in its possession, and seeks, above all, to heighten alliance collaboration in order to caution against any possible heightened risk-taking on the part of North Korea. What we cannot know is what awaits the North Korean system, its longer-term evolution. Is there, on the one hand, a level of weaponization that North Korea would deem sufficient for its purposes, that it would not pursue further nuclear weapons development? I'm not sure of that. North Korea is repeatedly emphasizing that it will pursue whatever level of modernization and weapons development it requires, and it is hinting that there must be multiple weapons programs. This, of course, is related very much to its enrichment capability. I believe that if North Korea does undertake a third nuclear test, it will be an HEU test. not a plutonium test, thereby giving the North, in its own mind, again, equivalence on either of those paths and either of those kinds of technologies. Now, all of these products, all of these developments, of course, are the products of what I will call the traditional North Korean system. Secretary of State Clinton once characterized North Korea's nuclear weapons activities as somewhat akin to a small child seeking attention. I think that this was not the correct analogy at all. This is a system of old men who have made pursuit of these capabilities their lifetime work. So the analogy begins to break down. Does a successor regime or successor generation make the same calculation as its elders? Or do they see the world and North Korea's place in it differently from those who are still atop the system today? We don't know. I would say that the odds are long against that. In an ideal world, I would think the North Korean leadership would prefer both to retain its nuclear capabilities as well as achieve some degree of economic recovery from its still deeply damaged economy. But our insistence, the United States' insistence, is that ultimately North Korea must choose. Does the day yet await that this choice can no longer be avoided? It's an open question, but it would seem to me that China's assistance to the North gives it that option to keep on going, to avoid that kind of fundamental reckoning. So these issues, it seems to me, remain unavoidable and persistent. We should never underestimate the capacity of such a seemingly beleaguered, vulnerable system to persist, to endure, to deflect, to evade, and defy, whether it is adversaries, allies, benefactors, or the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is a sobering picture, and I'm left with a sense that will other nuclear aspirants potentially draw the same conclusions that they too could pursue such a course of action? Or is North Korea truly sui generis, unlikely to be replicated by others? For all of these reasons, the ultimate consequences of what we observe will have profound implications, not only for the region, but for non-proliferation as a whole, and they bear very, very careful watching. Thank you.